Vielen Dank, Helena.
Danke. Ja, vielleicht zum Starten mit der Sprache. Das klingt immer so komisch, wenn man dann diese englischen Begriffe auf Deutsch hört. Schweizerdeutsch, Hochdeutsch, Englisch? English? Okay, so would English be okay for everyone? Anyone against it? Because it's announced in German?
Thank you so much.
But would English be okay? Any veto? No, okay, so we're gonna go for English then. Yeah, thanks for the invitation. So actually the invitation came via the SÄPT, and I think the question was how can we educate each other and ourselves, what training options are there. So they asked me if I want to do that, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. But like the training, that's a very short topic, so I thought it's interesting maybe to show a little bit the historical landscape in Switzerland, also the specificities in Switzerland, because it's a cool country, not just because of the mountains. And then also a little bit on psychedelic-assisted therapy kind of in general, so also to get an understanding why would it even be important to get trained in that specific therapy. Yeah, and then some training options. I hope that's fine, and you can interrupt me anytime and ask and discuss. Yeah, so you said that, why am I standing here? Because I'm in the SÄPT mainly, and I'm not the coordinator of the training program, but I'm involved and coordinating the study. So we have a study which I'm going to talk about also via the University of Basel, but mainly I'm at the University of Zurich doing research on DMT and 5-MeO-DMT and working also part-time with patients, mostly with psychedelics. So, yeah, context and history is what we start with. Then the current situation in Switzerland. Where should I stand so that everyone can see? Yeah. Yeah, I already talked a bit about what we're going to address, why training is important. Then also from the broad, like from the clinical trials to the broader application. What are the differences, because we have most experience from trials but not from the broader field, and then training in PhD. So maybe you have written that paper once by Franz Vollenweider and Michi Kometer about the history. I just want to point out the things that are relevant for Switzerland or that happened in Switzerland. You know, the synthesis of LSD in 1938 by Albert Hofmann, but more importantly, tomorrow will be Bicycle Day, as most of you know. So this was the 19th of April in 1943, where Albert Hofmann took LSD the second time, and it was a kind of bigger dose, and he drove back home by bicycle and wrote this trip report. So that's a well-known day. But then also, because women often get forgotten in the history in general, but also in the psychedelic history, June 9, the same year, Susi Rammstein, his lab assistant, took LSD as the first woman and drove back home by tram. So that's the tram day. And also many women were involved always in the history, sometimes even without a name, like this lady with a pistol inoculation of a Mutterkorn. From the Novartis test company archive. Then there were first studies at the Burg Hölzli, nowadays PUC, Zurich, by Stoll in humans. And then Albert Hofmann isolated and also synthesized psilocin. And he got the spores because Valentina and Gordon Wassons were in Mexico visiting Maria Sabina. And they got back home with the spores, and that's how Albert then synthesized psilocin and psilocybin. And also, Gordon Wasson is a name that everyone knows. Valentina, not everyone knows, but she was actually working as a therapist. Yeah, so in '62, they all went together to visit Maria Sabina in the Oaxaca mountains. And then, you know that there was the illegalization of psychedelics in 1975, also in Switzerland. And very interestingly, in 1990, psilocybin mushrooms were put from the food regulation to the Narcotics Act, which I find interesting. So until 1990, it was kind of in the framework of food regulation, magic mushrooms. So let's talk a little bit also about this counter movement, because we know about the hippie cultures, mostly in the States, in the US. But I think it's interesting to compare also a little bit historically the US and Switzerland and what happened there. So, you know, Switzerland has this beautiful image with the nice little villages in the mountains, and it's all very innocent and neutral, and we have a lot of cheese and money and the mountains. So even during the World Wars, Switzerland tried to keep this so-called neutral position. And the 1968 movements were less tense than in the US. So we had some movements here, but in the US there was a lot of racism, there was a Vietnam War, and so on. So the tensions were much stronger in the US than they were here. And it's maybe also interesting to know that since the 1930s there was something like a political movement in Switzerland that tried to protect like these Swiss values. It was more conservative. It was also to protect Switzerland against all these like totalitarian ideologies and so on. So this was something like a cultural but also political movement. So to get a feeling of the situation. But then, of course, we also had countercultures, for example, the Globus Krawalle in Zurich, and they rebelled against the structures, and also the Vietnam War, of course, less strongly than in the US, but there were protests also. And it was like a movement against this rigidity of the society, of institutions, of structures. And back then there were the Berglütlis. You can really read about that. They called themselves Berglütlis. So these were young people, but not only young people, but people that tried to find another way of living, like more connected to nature, more sustainable, more community-oriented, and they founded communities in the mountains and tried to live there self-sustainably. Unfortunately, this didn't last too long, and they came back. But it's interesting to see like how circles repeat, and like ideologies and the search for community and connection in a way. And they tried out LSD and experimented also with that. So there was this fight, let's say, fight for individual freedom, for democracy, for self-determination, and for personal development. Might ring a bell when you think about what we are trying to do nowadays also. Then there's also drug policy movements, and maybe some of you are still old enough already to remember these Initiativen. So we could vote against or for the legalization of cannabis. We were not lucky in 2008, and it was very interesting, like the propaganda. So you could see like eine Spritze. You see the how do you say? With the apple for cannabis. I don't know, whatever. So Switzerland had this kind of resistance against international drug policy, like for a long time. There's a history in resistance against this policy, already in the early 20th century with the opium trade. So there was this agreement international, but then Switzerland really tried to kind of hold back, and they only joined a bit later, and only because of international pressure. This reservation against international involvement. And then, of course, the Swiss pharma industry, because they were suppliers of heroin worldwide. So that also plays a role, of course. Our money, our industry, but also our neutrality or freedom, however you want to call it. And then you saw before the year 1975 the illegalization of LSD in Switzerland, and you might wonder, so late? Yes, it was so late because there was the so Switzerland signed the contract later than other countries, but like until it became a law, it took even some years more. So in 1971 it was signed by Switzerland. Yeah, so actually the period of repression of psychedelics in Switzerland is not so long. It was maybe 15 years or so, because already in the early 90s it started again with more research by Franz Vollenweider. So it's not like we had ages of prohibition. Yeah, so very different approaches to the drug problem in the US versus in Switzerland. Also, you might be aware of the Platzspitz situation in Zurich and the approach to heroin addiction, more integrative, more straightforward, more integrative and more permissive and more like to support the addicts. And in the US, it's more the war against the drug and criminalization of drug addicts. So very different situations, very interesting. And yeah, here's a graph. Oh, it's actually not submitted anymore, but published since 2 days. This graph we did with the published scientific articles on psychedelics. You find it in different variations here and there, and you see the first, I have this pointer, the first wave of psychedelic research. Of course, the research always follows, like the publications follow the research, because it takes a bit of time until it's published. But that's what we call the first wave of psychedelics, and then we talk about this repressive phase. We're still in the repressive phase, where headlines in the newspaper would look like this, like LSD, most dangerous. So these were the headlines in the New York Times during this repressive phase. And then second wave of psychedelic research, same newspaper, New York Times, but it looks very different. Psychedelic revolutions, reshaped psychiatry, and so on. So I just find it very fascinating how things change, and just the perception on topics change, and also how the media plays into that. Yeah, very interesting. And you know that we're in the middle of the hype. Maybe already, if you know, realize that most startups have crashed already. Maybe we're already post-hype. I don't know, post-peak hype, or maybe in the hype. I don't know. But yeah, you have these high hopes, the psychedelic CEO leadership, then of course the Michael Pollan effect, and so on. You know it all from the media. Then a little bit, because that's what you might be also interested, the foundation of the SÄPT, or the history of the SÄPT. So what's the SÄPT? That's the Swiss Association for Psycholytic Therapy, Swiss Medical Association for Psycholytic Therapy. It was founded in 1985, I think 1 year before MAPS. And then there were applications to use LSD and MDMA, and at that time DHG was responsible in the Federal Office of Public Health, the BAG, here in Bern. And because of this atmosphere and this attitude of Switzerland, there were not so many regulations. Also, ethics committees were only founded in the 90s. So it was all a bit like open, regulatory freedom as a key word. So, of course, this is like uncertainties, but maybe also opportunities. And then there was this collaboration between DHG and then also Brenneisen, Pharmacology in Bern, who did the research. And I like to see that a little bit like the relationship between Matthias Licht in Basel nowadays, who would be like Brenneisen, and the Federal Office of Public Health. So this, like Switzerland is so small, everybody knows everyone, so you have these very personal connections, and that's maybe also a chance. And then in '88, the founding members of the SÄPT got the permission to actually use LSD and MDMA to work with patients. So yeah, ironically, the institutions against which the youth and other people like rebelled against were the ones that made the possibility or enabled that this could happen here in Switzerland. So it's a very interesting country. Yeah, then in the early 90s, Switzerland had this kind of advantage in the terms of doing research here because it was so liberal, and that's why Franz Vollenreiter became very interesting as a research partner for people in the US. So quite a bit of money flew into Switzerland to do the research because it was possible here. Yeah, and then there was a first training initiated by the SÄPT, 89 to 91. So that was actually the first training. Nowadays we had a training. Oh yeah, you see it on the next slide. So yeah, that was the start of training. But then in 1990, someone died in France in an Iboga ceremony, and it was not related closely to what was happening in Switzerland, but one of the psychiatrists who had the permissions was involved in that case, so all these exceptional permissions were stopped, and yeah, so these therapies had to end in 1993. And then there was a first attempt for a depression psilocybin study, which was rejected, so also like a history of some trials and errors and failures. And then 2006 there was a big symposium to celebrate Albert Hoffmann's 100th birthday, and this really caught a lot of attention, also international, so many people came here. Ralph Metzner, Stan Grof, all the big names gathered here to celebrate Albert Hoffmann's birthday, which was kind of already reflecting the beginning maybe of the hype somehow. There was this first MDMA PTSD study by Peter Oehn and Vreni Wittmer, and then the first LSD anxiety study by Peter Gasser. So, and nowadays, that's more the situation nowadays. Since 2014, there are these exceptional permissions for limited medical use. And by law, this is an option we have by law, but it was only 2014 that Peter approached the BAG, and he got the permission. It was on the 26th of November, I think. He just sent me these letters recently because I asked him. So the very first permission. Interesting. And then there was this 30th anniversary of the SÄPT, which was again like an international symposium with a lot of media attention also, and the second study. And then there was this actually second training offered by the SÄPT, 2018 to 22. We usually call it the first training because it's the first since a while, but actually it's the second. And now ongoing, the third training offered by the SÄPT. So current situation, as I said, it's about this article, beschränkte medizinische Anwendung von verbotenen Betäubungsmitteln, which says that if someone really suffers and kind of many different options have been tried out, medications and treatments, then if you can argue that these patients would maybe benefit from psychedelics, you can apply to get this permission. And that means only medical doctors, so I can't apply. Maybe many of you also not, but you can work with psychiatrists that get the permission. So it's not a first choice therapy, but like an exceptional treatment option. So these are the numbers, no numbers for 14 and 15, but it's maybe also very low, or it's certainly very low. But then you see the increase in applications. So this is until, what was it, November, I think, numbers until November 23. Psilocybin wasn't available until 2021. And these are the numbers for individual cases. So it's really low numbers, so it's not many. We are at maybe 1,000 permissions, individual permissions nowadays. So it's approximately 60 medical doctors that applied and got permission 1,000 times, which means because you get the permission for 1 year and you can extend it for an additional year. So these 1,000 include also the extensions. So it's not so many. Do you have a question?
So these permissions is permission for every single patient per year?
Yeah, so as a medical doctor, you can apply for one single case, and you have to explain what has been tried, what's the problem, why do you think LSD or psilocybin or MDMA could help, and maybe add some references or so, and then hopefully you get the permission. And then you can, that's maybe the next slide. Yeah, then you're...
Sorry, there's not a maximum of people that can apply. Like there's 1,000 is just approximately the number.
No, that's just how it is.
Or is it a limit?
No, there's no limit. I mean, that's very interesting because cannabis was also this exceptional permission thing until they had folders and folders of these. And at some point, the regulatory agencies need to reflect, is this still an exceptional permission? Mm-hmm. So we should also not overdo it and just try, we should also keep in mind it's an exception, but still we should maybe also try to use it more often so that at some point the regulatory bodies will have to rethink, hey, what do we do with these exceptions? Mm. But it can go all sorts of directions. They can become more restrictive again, or say, hey, this has become out of hand. Or so it's really, we don't have a right for that. There's no right to get one of these exceptional permits. It's really the regulatory bodies that decide case by case.
What do you think would be the best situation for psychedelic-assisted therapy?
The best situation?
So that it's not, so who should use it, or who should be allowed to perform or to...
That's a whole day we could talk about it. I mean, that's also the topic of education and training. I think it really depends on the patient. I think it depends on the relationship between the patient and the therapist. It depends on the therapist's qualities and his understanding of what's going on in the psychedelic experience, and his understanding of the situation the patient is in also.
No, I meant more, who do you think should be allowed to participate in psychedelic-assisted therapy? So not
like
only
the patient,
treatment-resistant patients, for
yeah.
example, or who?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the treatment-resistant cases are those that profit most. I think actually those that have some sort of resources, they profit a little bit more because they have some resources to do something with what they experience. So that's, but that's not the legal situation we are in. But of course, and I mean, there's also the discussion around personal development. So there are countless of studies that show potentially beneficial effects also for non-patients. But that's like a whole other field. And also maybe to understand, so there are, let's say, 3 ways how psychedelics can get into society. One is by medicalization, which is the drug approval route, which means we might one day be able to use them as treatments like we are. but like as approved drugs. But that doesn't mean they're legal for non-patient populations. So that's one route. Then there's decriminalization or legalization, which is another route, which also allows people to take substances even though they are not patients, which is something that's happening in like Colorado, the States, and like other countries nowadays.
Germany.
Yeah, slowly. And then there's the religious route, which is happening also in the US, also in the Netherlands, but by law that's not possible in Switzerland. So you won't get it legal for religious purposes here in Switzerland. Yeah, so that was.
Sorry, what about the applications that were not accepted?
There are not so many, I think.
Okay, so usually.
Yeah, I mean, they sometimes ask questions back, but if you, like, I think the people that do it, they know what they do and they know the cases and they can explain. So they know what the conditions are. I don't know if it will change once more and more practitioners try to get the permissions. But I mean, I don't know how many cases were not permitted, but I know of many that they had some questions and they asked and then we replied and then we still, most of the time. I don't know, I mean, I don't have all the insights. Yeah, and then I think that was your question. So the doctor gets the permission and then he's kind of free how to use it. Not meaning that he can just do anything, he also needs to explain that in his application. But he's kind of responsible for the indication, which he already writes in the application. And of course, indications usually those that are studied, like depression, anxiety. But if you have literature and data to show, hey, this has been tried out and I have this patient, I think it could help, there are also options for other indications. And then also the substance, also the dose is something that the therapist then decides, also the setting, group or individual setting, the frequency. So it's quite free, which is a very different setting or situation compared to Australia, which legalized or medicalized the substances. But there it's much more restricted. Yeah, so psychotherapeutic flexibility and freedom, which of course also requires therapists to have a clue about what they're doing. And yeah, it's also learning by doing. You have seen the numbers raising, and of course many people enter the field and they don't have this decades of experience like some of the old SÄPT people, but it's also learning by doing and exchange. So we just wrote a little bit about this situation in Switzerland if you want to read more about that, the same numbers that I just gave you. Yeah, so PAT in practice and why a specific training would be important at all, because you might wonder, well, it's just a psychotherapy and you add some psychedelic sessions, but why would that be important? Yeah, I like this dodo bird verdict because, like, maybe some of you know that from your psychology studies, the psychotherapy studies that have shown it doesn't matter so much which therapeutic school is applied, and all schools do equally well. So everyone must get prizes. And it's more the general factors of psychotherapy that make the therapy work. So it's the relationship, it's the resources, it's the dealing with the issues, it's the trust, clarification of, and also expectations. Rings a bell. Placebo is also about expectations, maybe. So it's not so important if you're a psychoanalyst or a CBT therapist or systemic, as long as you as a therapist embody what you're doing. Yeah, and maybe also to understand that in psychedelic-assisted therapy we have this interesting mixture of, on the one hand, having very specific factors like the psychedelic substance, the neuroplasticity and the action in the brain, and this very biomedical understanding, but we also have the psychotherapy and the contextual paradigm and the common factors and psychedelic as amplifiers of whatever is there, and potentially also of all these psychotherapeutic factors. And also another understanding which I think is very helpful to understand psychedelic-assisted therapy, because we have seen these studies for depression, anxiety, OCD, and psilocybin, LSD. So it's not so specific. We can't say we use only psilocybin to treat only depression. That's an illusion. So it's maybe more about these underlying mechanisms. And there are models, there are systematic, or there are models that support this approach, and I think it's useful to know that. Yeah, and I don't know if you want to go into that. The European approach, there's my mouse, it's a bit annoying. So historically in Europe there was this more psycholytic approach with many sessions, low dose, and really more from the psychodynamic perspective, so loosening of boundaries, transference and counter-transference, insights, biographical stuff. So this was historically more in Europe. And in North America, more like high dose, one time, transformative, ego dissolution, more like these existential things, and with high doses. And nowadays, I would say we're kind of mixing them. So we're aware that in a session both can happen, biographical stuff, but also a mystical experience, and we as therapists need to be prepared for all that. So I think maybe that slide is not so bad to get an understanding that training is necessary, because we need to be open for whatever comes. And we need to be open for whatever comes in usual psychotherapy, but it's even pronounced when psychedelics come into play.
Is anyone today still using these really high psychedelic doses, like 600 microgram? Or?
Yeah, I was also wondering. I mean, we have a patient that gets like 60 psilocybin, but just because he doesn't feel so much. So I don't know. I don't think like in studies, like even the high dose studies use like 200 mics. So these very full-blown, I don't think in studies this is used, but recreationally for sure. Yeah.
Maybe a rather provocative question.
Yeah.
But as a medical doctor or a therapist, if your psilocybin experience is is so transforming, how can you be prepared for what your patient is going through if you haven't tried it yourself, the medication you're giving?
Yeah.
I mean, the human psyche is so big. How do you want to be prepared for what's going on with the substance? You can do all the research for it.
Very
I
good
don't
question.
know how long, but how do you want to be prepared?
I have a slide prepared for you to ask you exactly this. So can we postpone that to later and just... very good question. A trainer of mine, not in psychedelics but in psychotherapy, he said, be the most experienced patient in the room. You can. Yeah, and also like to get an understanding about this psychotherapeutic process. That's really, at least in the practice nowadays in Switzerland, that's the understanding. It's a psychotherapy ongoing, and the psychedelic experience is part of that, and you prepare whatever is there and you integrate. Also, this term integration is a bit absurd, because integration is what happens every day. We are constantly integrating what we're experiencing, and that's also what we're doing in psychotherapy. And of course, if there's a psychedelic experience and which might have provoked a lot of something, then you might be dealing with that in your integration process. But it's really, I really like to understand it as something ongoing with some maybe a bit different experiences. But just last Friday I was sitting with a patient in a group, and he said, the more I do that therapy, the less it becomes different to who I am in daily life, and I really like that. So his understanding of the world and his state of being with a substance becomes more and more aligned. I really loved to hear that. As a rule of thumb for the practice in Switzerland, so that you get an idea, just a concrete idea, is that groups usually are maybe between 4 to 10 patients, 2 to 3 therapists, and maybe 1 psychedelic session each 3 months. And in our case, we add some additional group therapy sessions, like maybe every month, and of course, shortly before and after the session, on top of the regular psychotherapy. Of course, in individual PAT, it's different. You can maybe also target it a bit more individually, but in the groups, that's often like the frequency every 3 months. And not only in our case, so I know from many people that they're doing it like that. And you see there's a lot of experience and a lot of implicit knowledge. So that's very interesting also to realize how much experience we have in this little country. And the people in Australia and Canada and the US, they ask us, but how do you do it? And no one really writes about it, so it's not so concrete, but it's very implicit. And I think we're changing it now and also sharing the knowledge. Yeah, and then something about the setting, which is also part of the education. So how do you prepare a setting? That was actually a study setting, that was not in a therapy, but I like the picture very much. Individual or group, and room, atmosphere, music, instruments, who are the therapists, the attitudes, the location. Is overnight stay possible, which is cool, but most cases not possible, and the overall structure. Yeah, and also very important for the training of therapists, that was actually referring maybe to what you asked, that it's part of a training. So who are we as therapists? Of course, that's part of our psychotherapy training always, but it's something that's maybe, there's a very nice article that came out by Nicholas Langlitz and Alex, I don't know his surname, about psychotherapy as a way of living. And I think that's a nice attitude, that you keep on living that. So attitude, you know it from Carl Rogers, empathy, acceptance, congruency. I think, that's like the basis. Other things that I like are humor and stillness. So the ability to be still is one of the most difficult things to learn for these long days. And then you have these tools, and that can all be part of your training. So Phelps wrote a paper about developing competencies for therapists. I highly recommend this paper. I won't go too much into that now, what it takes. How much time do we have? Okay. So I want to lose a couple of words on this transition from the studies to the broader field. And for that I like this tweet, in, how would you say, to not tweet anymore, X, this tweet, and he criticizes that psychedelic studies are not blinded, highly motivated patients and therapists and funders, and intense therapeutic attention and short follow-ups, and you can add some more small sample sizes, often open label, very specific patient populations, little comorbidity, selection bias, standardized treatment manuals, time restrictions, many things that you could criticize that are different in the real field compared to what we are doing in the studies. So when it's about broader applications, we are talking about psychotherapeutic flexibility versus manualized treatment protocols, patient populations. There were some questions about that. Also costs and insurances. There are 2 interesting studies about cost effectiveness. Interestingly, also a recent paper about group psychedelic therapy, which is a cool thing in itself, but also in terms of financial sustainability, an interesting setting. Yeah, so many questions that we have to deal with when we are in the actual field. And the challenges that also relate to the necessity for training. We have a lot of patients and very little therapeutic expertise. And personal experience that might lead to the therapeutic expertise. And also the question about quality versus quantity. So you can imagine we have 24 people in the training, and already for the next cohort, without even announcing that we plan the next cohort, 200 people on the waiting list. So how do we deal with that? Do we just have online trainings and address as many people as possible, to train as many people as possible, or do we want to keep this quality of really having a group process with 24 people, or do we have a mix, or do we do both, or how do we address this? Because you can maybe scale up the substance, but you can't scale up the expertise once the substances are on the market. Yeah. Oh, I think we can skip that. Oh. Yeah, and now maybe I don't skip that, because there's a lot of discussions in the scientific field. Is the psychedelic effect even important, or is it just the drug doing the neuroplasticity thing in the brain? Do we need the experience? Do we not need it? And there's a lot of discussions going on. And also the next one, is the psychotherapy even relevant, or can you just give the substance to someone, make sure she or he is safe? And the idea of evidence-based medicine is having the trials, RCT, data, but it's also about clinical expertise and patient preferences or patient values. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because some things cannot really easily be tackled with doing a study. Some things are just ethically not possible to study, for example, or because of other reasons difficult to study. So I like that more and more people are also publishing, there's the As a Form of Life, publishing papers about the expertise, about their experience. Also, that's a very cool paper about the experience. They are all experienced in clinical trials with patients, and they're responding to some of these discussions by also saying that some of these distinctions are just an illusion, and that how it really looks like. So I really encourage everyone who has experience to go out with case studies. I don't know. I think that's cool. So the role of the SÄPT and other associations. I think it's basically experience, expertise, the network. I think that's key. Network. And also in that sense, supervision, peer review, so the possibility to know people, exchange, and really have a trustworthy foundation where you can go to your peers and say, hey, I did this and that with my patient, I think I fucked up, and what do you think? And you need a foundation of trust to be so open about things you might have done a little bit wrong. And also training and symposia, so a little bit of research, a little bit of politics. Yeah, and then there are these new associations. They were founded last year in the Swiss Romande, I think in Bern we're a little bit in the middle, so some people might also want to join these associations. And the cool thing is that there's also an exchange between these associations, so it's not like, of course, everyone does locally and in their cultures and in their expertise what they're doing, but there's also an exchange between the associations. So now, finally, what you were actually asking for. As I said, there's like this problem between quality and quantity. How do we address so many people that want to learn? And there's a variety of options, and you find like so much stuff in the internet. And I guess there's just a huge variability. So there might be trainings that have a very good quality, and others that are, I mean, you get things like be a certified psychedelic sitter after, I don't know, an online training. So people promise a lot of strange things, which I find also strange. Yeah. Of course, you need to check if there's online or offline, and maybe also reports, and how they are also maybe embedded within their cultures, within their country, their institutions. And also a distinction like regarding the target group. Is it to just learn how to be a trip sitter, maybe in a recreational setting? Is it to learn how to become a therapist? What are the requirements? Do they require that you are already a trained therapist and on top learn about psychedelics, or is the training offering something like foundational therapist training? And there are also very different curricula. If you look at the US, there's a lot on ethics and inclusiveness and diversity, like half of the courses are about that. And in Europe, of course, we also have all these topics, but it's less pronounced. It's maybe less of so much an issue, I don't know. Maybe it's an issue and we're still blind, but it's just good to look at the curricula. Yeah, some examples are the CIAS in California. Janice Phelps, who wrote that article I recommended to you, is the head of this training, very great woman. And they have in-person meetings, but it's maybe with 100 people, and they have a lot of online stuff, so they do that balance a little bit different than we do, but it's a good exchange, and to maybe see how do they do it, how do we do it. Then there's the MIND training in Germany. MAPS also trained psychotherapists for their MDMA, for the studies, but also for the time when they become approved. And many of these approval or of these drug companies, they are doing trainings in the framework of their drug approval studies. Yeah, so I stumbled upon that learning framework. I don't know what I should think about it, but they try to kind of put together things. You see a lot of ethical abuse. So in the US it's really safety, 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 don't touch. So also the legal system is very different. So the ethics is more never ever cross boundaries. And I think in Europe, or at least in Switzerland, we also realized, well, ethically it can also be a neglect if we don't realize when someone would need touch. But in the US it's really this never ever do anything that could somehow be experienced as crossing a boundary, but also because of the legal system. And interestingly, they have all these cases. Yeah, so these are it's just an example. I thought I'd just bring it. Yeah, and then I try to make sense of what are actually the pillars of training. I think the foundation is the individual thing, what we're doing, medicine, psychology, our studies, the learning by doing, the internships, connecting, exchange, all these things. And then we have this Weiterbildung, there are Fortbildung. Also, that's maybe also already SÄPT specific, but not only. I mean, you can think of that beyond the SÄPT, and we are more and more thinking about courses and workshops so that you can also get some insights without being in this 24 people training. Symposia, so I highly recommend coming to these conferences and symposia, and maybe just write to the SÄPT that you want to be informed, because what we don't have yet is just a newsletter list for people that are not members, which I think is not so cool, but could be changed. I think also that it's an ongoing process is necessary, and maybe you have other ideas. I mean, it's a process. I don't know how you learn, how you do that. That's the example of our Weiterbildung. So you see the 3 years, you see these retreats, the intensive retreats, theory days in between, and what we did to kind of address this need from many people, or this interest, this broad interest, is that we opened up the theory days so that the afternoons are open for everyone. So if you want to meet once a semester in Basel and in Zurich, you can maybe write to the SÄPT that you're interested, and it's just an evening of some talks and most importantly exchange and connecting. Yeah. And then we have, that's a paper we wrote about that, a short article. We have this longitudinal open label pilot study, which refers to the question of your colleague about the personal experience, because we set up a study to look into the question, what's the subjective value of personal experiences, the subjective benefits or risks for the therapists. So they have the chance to get 6 psychedelic experiences over the course of these 3 years during the retreats, and they also have the sitter experience. So that's what they do, and we will find out what they tell us about the role of the personal experience. And I really want to also, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but maybe you will also have thoughts. There might be ethical considerations why it would not be good to require it, or for example, a colleague of mine, he said the worst people are those that had only 2 very nice psychedelic experiences, and now they think they can accompany people. Then he rather have someone without any experience, but with a very open and empathic attitude. So it's not a guarantee, and I don't think psychedelic experiences would make you a better therapist necessarily. But as you say, right, if you don't have that experience, you need quite a bit of openness to handle that also.
Yes, and I also wonder with the psilocybin, why are people or therapists thinking about, let's try it to have a better connection to the patient, but no one will ever be like, let's take antidepressants for half a year to find out how that feels for the other patients. I wonder why. It's the same principle. It's a medicine you prescribe, but is there an antidepressant retreat for therapists? Or are they thinking about taking it for
very good question.
a month? I just wonder.
Yeah. That's a very I mean, we have this legal dilemma here, so we can't even require anyone. I doubt that it would be good to require a personal experience, but we cannot even do it because of the legal possibilities. But of course there are options, like you can participate in studies, you can do maybe holotropic breathwork. It's not the same, but it can give you an idea of the setting of something. Or just go to Brazil if you have good references. But I don't know. Yeah.
So I didn't quite understand. So can you legally give substances in the training? to the people who do
Because
the
it's a
training
study.
or not?
Because it's a study.
And now, because you're doing the study, you can
Yeah, I mean, I think really, I mean, I'm really also a scientist that, like, since many years I went to these conferences and I saw pharmacological doctors changing as persons. So I was always interested in, well, isn't it just the therapist that changes? And that's why the therapy becomes more efficient, maybe. So, like, I'm actually really interested in the therapist's variables. But of course, it has this very nice benefit that they can have legal experiences. But as a research question, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. So, like, as you say, it does something with the way maybe you don't even need to have the personal experience, but sitting with patients going through this experience does something with you as a therapist if you are at least a little bit open to what's going on. And is not this what's actually doing the therapy? So, yeah.
But do you think of the idea of the therapists microdosing the substance while they do the therapy?
Well, for legal issues, I don't know. I mean, if something happens, you have a problem, and also the whole field will have a problem. But I mean, many therapists in the underground did that, and not only microdoses. They had, I mean, Friederike Meckel-Fischer is one of the very few that wrote about it because of the legal case. You might know her book, and she and many others did that they also took the medicine to be in that state together with the patients. I sometimes take some theobromine, like from the cacao. It's legal, but it can also do something. Or just the contact high. I mean, yeah. But yeah, I wouldn't do actual. Yeah, but you can try. But the contact high is also something very interesting, which would be worth investigating. Yeah, maybe in a nutshell, something we always have to say, psychedelics are no magic pills. Many people still suffer, and they are even more frustrated because it was the last hope. And they see that it works for others, and they become suicidal because sometimes it's really destabilizing also. Then, yeah, they can facilitate psychotherapeutic processes, but it takes time usually. And yeah, I think I could convince you maybe that PAT requires a specific expertise, but on top of the therapeutic foundation. And also the thing with the psychotherapeutic flexibility, which requires expertise as a dilemma or as a question to address. And consequently the need for education network, what you're all doing right now, or we're all doing right now. And something we didn't really talk about, but I think that's very important, that all the ethical principles of psychotherapy are equally valid for PAT, plus of course we have some special on top issues just because of that even more vulnerable state. And yeah, maybe, yeah, everything that you do, I can just encourage you to also document that. So if you take courses, if you go to conferences, just note it down, make a portfolio for yourself. It might be valuable one day that you just have a bit structured what you did, and you can show others that you're in the field and interested and since a long time. So that's we don't have like certifications yet, but at some point that might be valuable. Yeah, the Swiss quality, I like. Yeah, many of the historical things you find in these two books, highly recommended. And some further information, I can maybe also send you the slides or something, or you have it in the YouTube afterwards. And yeah, if you want to educate and train yourself, do what you're doing right now. Go to all these events, go to conferences. The next conferences Like that's one of my, or it's my one favorite in Europe, the ICPR. Very cool, good quality, and because I'm a speaker, I can even give you a code where you can get some 100 euros off if you want to buy a ticket. I mean, I don't get anything for it, but if you want to go anyways, yeah, I think that's what you can do. And I think that's it. And I think the newsletter is from the research in Zurich, so that's not related to what I was talking about. But you can still get it if you want. I hope I could answer the questions that originally came from.
So who exactly can do the training? So is it only psychiatrists also? Or
Psychologists and psychiatrists, and if you have at least started with the psychotherapy training or can like write a motivation why and what you have been doing so far, that helps.
But if you're a psychologist, you cannot apply to do the therapy, you have to work with a psychiatrist?
Yeah, but I think like for me the SÄPT is really like you get to know people there, it's really a network. And I mean I have many colleagues, I work with 3 together, and I think if I would move to another canton I would find other colleagues there. So really network, and then you can do the work.
So and do you have then like a group you usually work with these people, or is it changing for every patient a little bit?
So we have groups, and like I showed this 3-month cycle where there are some group sessions and the psychedelic group session, and like after each cycle someone can either go out or come in, but most of them stay for a year or 2. And then sometimes we have individual patients, but it's hard, like not so much. And yeah, it helps if you can do your abrechnen yourself. I mean, I'm not a fully trained psychotherapist yet, so I do all mixed up. I'm not in a nice order, but I'm finishing the training now. But I have options to also do the Abrechnungen, which is good if you want to do the work also. It's necessary part of it. So find a practice that where you can work and that allows you to work like this also.
Even though you're working with a psychiatrist, Abrechnen is mandatory for yourself.
Yeah, I mean you
have
do it for
individual
your.
patients.
Yeah, I mean in the psychiatry it's different. We also started with groups there, and there I'm just paid my monthly salary for my 20% that I work there, and the Abrechnung goes over the clinic. But in the group practice, every hour that I work, yeah, I mean it's really depends also on the module. If you're in a group practice with a psychiatrist and a psychologist and you get your monthly thing, then it's maybe different. But if you do it yourself, then yeah, it's all complicated. And you can also not like that's also very important. So the insurance doesn't pay the substance, it doesn't pay the 8 hours, so it only pays the maximum of psychotherapy that you're allowed to, which is you work a lot for free anyways.
Maybe one last question. You talked about, I don't know if I understood it, you tried contact high?
Yeah.
What's that?
So when you are sitting in a room with, let's say, 8 patients on MDMA and psilocybin, and there's energy in the room, and there's the music, and there's the stillness, and there's the calmness within you and the sensitivity to what's happening in the room, then sometimes you feel as if you were on a drug. Really, a little bit. That's the contact high.
I mean, I had the same, and I didn't drink when I was younger, and I always felt I have this contact high even while drinking.
With alcohol?
Like my friends drank, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
So I get it.
Okay. And I can thank you so much for your
Thank
talk.
you.
It was very interesting. And we will put this video on YouTube. And if any one of you wants to stay for a little apero, we will have apero outside afterwards. So you can like also start your networking today. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for listening and the invitation.